Welcome to Gever.com, where the wise get wiser. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the 14th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And with that, we're also going to look at a few really important and key words from Hebrew, such as the word for snake, and even the name Nathan. And of course, perhaps one of the more important words of the Bible, that word for soul that we find in the Old Testament. Also, with this, of course, we want to practice our reading and getting better at understanding Hebrew, especially from the Bible. So we're going to look at a few key verses from Genesis, Exodus, and even Isaiah. So this is going to be a really jam-packed lesson for us today. So let's go ahead and get started. So we are going to be looking at this letter Nun. But before we get there, let's do a little bit of practice with our Hebrew alphabet. And hopefully, again, at this point, this will be very familiar and you can perhaps even do it by yourself without any help. But let's go ahead and do it quickly, and then we'll do it more slowly together. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, let's do a little bit more slowly this time. We have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, and Tav. All right, well, that's our Hebrew alphabet. So let's go ahead and talk about our letter Nun. Well, like we've seen with a few of our other letters, this letter Nun actually has two variations or two forms. And so, as we've mentioned before, this one here called the final form will only occur at the end of a word if it is the last letter of a word. So the Nun Sofit, as they call it. And that means everywhere else, we will see this regular form of the letter Nun. So if it's at the beginning of a word, in the middle, it'll be this form. And if it's at the very end, the last letter, it will be this one. Okay? So how do we write these letters? Well, let's start with our regular form. And so again, we want to think about our letter space, if you will. And so for this letter, we really just begin by drawing a horizontal line that fills the whole space, and then a horizontal line that is along the bottom here from right to left. So a vertical line down, a horizontal line to the left, and that's really our letter Nun. So pretty simple, actually. And it sort of looks like a capital L in English. So hopefully that could maybe help. Maybe it will be confusing. I'm not sure since it's the letter N or Nun and not the letter L. But as you can see here, pretty simple. And this is really the core of the letter, as we'll see in comparison to some other fonts and things like that. All right, well, how about the final form? Well, the final form is very simple, and that's because it's just a straight line, one straight line. So you go from the top of our line or letter space, and it goes all the way to the bottom and actually goes beneath our letter space. So it actually extends below. And this will, of course, be important to remember because there are some other letters that will look similar to this, but this one goes beneath the space, as we see here. And I actually like to refer to letters like this and the cough and others as the Flintstones letters. If you remember that old cartoon where the Flintstones would stick out their feet to stop the car because they didn't have modern brakes, right? And so this is kind of what is happening, if you will, for our letters like the noon, who have a final form. So they look like this. And then when they want to stop a word, as the Flintstones did their car, they have to stick out that foot and stop the car. And so you'll see this is fairly common with these final form letters. The only one that doesn't do it actually is the mem. So that is our final form of the noon and our regular form of the noon. So let's look at a few of the different fonts to get an idea of what's important, what's key, what's common. So as we see in this font for the regular, and this is somewhat common, you will see a little bit of a top part to this letter. And so the core of the letter really is sort of like a capital L, if you will. But in most of the fonts, there will be a little crook on the top here, a little piece here that kind of sticks to the left. For our final form of the noon, it is typically just a straight line, so this one is very basic, no fanciness to it at all. As you can see here, there's a little bit more fanciness, if you will, and this one ends up looking a little bit almost more like a backwards C, lowercase c, right? But again, you have to keep in mind that really the core of the letter is that sort of backwards L. And this one too has a little bit of a crook at the top here, but that is really just a fancy addition. This one as well, pretty basic, but this one is almost maybe a little tricky because the top and the bottom are basically the same size. And so that would be, very confusing perhaps. This one's a little bit more fancy, kind of more similar to our Hebrew Bible text font. But you can see here again, there's often a fancy little crook on the top, which unfortunately does make it a little bit more difficult to identify sometimes. Now, if we think about this letter from ancient times and its earliest origins, in the Proto-Sinaitic, you can see here, it's sort of this long squiggly line, somewhat reminiscent of that final form of the noon. And if you think about it, it actually kind of looks like a snake. And as we'll see with one of our key words, this letter is related or derived from the word for snake. But then in Paleo-Hebrew, it gets a little bit simplified and it looks a little less like a snake. And actually perhaps starts to look a little bit more like the Greek N or nu that we find. And so similarly, we have this Paleo developing into our Greek, which for English is where we derive our letters. So a similar origin for both Hebrew and English, actually. So what about the sound? Well, thankfully, just like the mem, the noon is very similar and equivalent to that in English. So it's just the N sound, n, right? So nothing special. And even for the regular form and final form, again, they're just variations on the writing, not in the letter itself or the sound of it or interpretation or meaning. It's just how it's written, okay? So both of these will sound like the N. All right, well, let's do a little bit of a comparison. Like I said, some of these are going to be tricky, especially in context when you're trying to just decipher and figure out what you're looking at. So hopefully this will be helpful. So we see here, of course, the noon, the regular form of the noon, but then we see our kaf, that K sound, k. And we also see the bet, the B sound or V sound. And so you can see here, especially depending on the font, they could be very easy to misidentify or to mix up. So like I mentioned, it's really helpful to remember some of these key aspects or components to the letters. So with our bet, remember bet is for house, and so houses have foundations, okay? The kaf is just like our lowercase c, the k, like in cat, but backwards. And then our noon is a little bit tricky because it kind of looks like both of these in this font. And that's because it has this fancy little crook at the top, but really it's just that sort of L, if you will. All right, well, how about our final form of the noon? And so in our final form, as you see here, this can be very easily mixed up with these other letters. So we have here the noon, the final form of the noon, the vav, and our final kaf, the final kaf. And you could perhaps add in here the dalet as well, but what's unique about the final kaf and the final noon is that they both go beneath our space. And so if you see this at the end, you may be tempted or just tricked into thinking it's one or the other. But you'll notice that the final kaf, this top part, is very key and central to the actual form of the letter. Whereas for this final noon, it's really more of a stylistic kind of fancy crook on the top. It's really just a long straight line, which is actually the exact same in many ways as the vav, except the vav stays within our space. Okay, it does not go beneath. So we have our noon, all right, the N sound, our vav, the V, or in ancient times W sound, and then our final kaf, the K sound. Okay? All right, so now let's look at a few key words. Well, let's begin with the word that our letters derive from, and that is the word for snake or serpent. So this word is nachash. 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 And so nachash is our word for serpent or snake. And so this occurs even in Genesis 3, right? With that crafty serpent snake in the Garden of Eden who deceives Adam and Eve, the first man and woman. And in ancient times, the snake was known in all of the ancient world, really, to be sort of this image, or even in certain areas like Egypt and Babylon was in the form of gods. They were thought of as gods, of course, since many of those nations had a polytheistic kind of view of the gods and their images and representations. And so, even in the biblical text, it does refer to this ancient deceiver, a fallen angel of some sort, which we later, seems to be developed into the person or the entity known as Satan, the devil, that ancient serpent, it says in Revelation 12. And so nachash is that word that is used in Genesis 3 and is an interesting one because, again, serpents were thought of as symbols of wisdom or cunningness, if you will, and were even worshipped in some of the other peoples. All right, well, let's look at another word here, and that's the word nacham. Nacham. And nacham is a verb, which means to grieve or to console. In other words, if you're sorrowful, you kind of grieve. And so this can be used in a few different ways, and we'll actually look at this in one of our key verses. All right, another one here is nacha. Nacha. And nacha is the verb he led. We'll also look at this with one of our key verses. All right, well, here's that interesting and important word we find in the Old Testament that is nephesh. Nephesh, which can mean something like soul or life or animation. And this is what is sometimes a little bit tricky about the word nephesh, is that especially earlier on, nephesh seems to be used in a more generic sense of life or just your animation, being alive. You have some animating force to you. So animals have nephesh, humans have nephesh. Everything that is alive and breathing, so to speak, has nephesh. But it definitely, for sure, in the Psalms and even some of the prophets, takes on a much more strong sense of the soul, perhaps as we might think of it nowadays in more modern times as well. So it has a much more spiritual sense, especially in certain text. But there are some scholars who kind of contend that there's much more of an overlap and similarity and consistency between those uses, and that perhaps we shouldn't drive such a strong division between the sense of soul and that kind of life animation, even from earlier times. So in either case, it is a really important and key word from the Old Testament, and especially as it develops into the New Testament. All right, another interesting and important word that's used, and you'll find throughout, especially the prophets, and that's this word Neum. Neum. And Neum is really just this kind of word that means like the utterance. It's typically used of the Lord. So, Neum Adonai, right? So the declaration or the utterance or sort of thus says the Lord, if you will. So this comes up in very important key places because this is places where the Bible is saying this is something directly from the Lord, a command, a warning, a promise, things like that. All right, so we also have an important and interesting word that comes up from time to time, and that is navat. Navat. And navat just means he looked, or he saw. Another one here is nagash. Nagash. And nagash is to approach or to come near. So as you can imagine, this is used in most common situations of like approaching a king, or especially in the Psalms and prophets, like approaching the Lord. And we have the word here for nahar, which is a river. And we've actually seen this in some of our verses already. Nahar. Now, this is a very important and very, very common word, and this is the word nasa. Nasa. Now, nasa literally means he lifted or he carried even. But for perhaps many reasons, it gets used in a lot of different ways, even in the sense of to marry. So you literally, when they say they're getting married, they might say like, I lifted a woman. So a man lifted a woman. He picked up a girl, so to speak. And so nasa means he picked her up or he married her. And so a very common word because it can just mean to lift or to pick up as well, which occurs a lot. All right, and then here's an interesting one because it's both a name and a verb. And in ancient Hebrew, this is very, very common for names to literally just be words, right? So in English, oftentimes our names don't really mean much of anything except how they connect us to maybe ancestors, parents, things like that. But in ancient Hebrew, names actually had just everyday word meanings. So we have here the words Natan and Natan. So Natan, as you can see here with two vowels that look the same, are going to be is our word for Nathan, the name. But when we have Natan with these two different forms of the A vowel, we're going to have the verb, he gave. He gave. And this can also be used in a few different ways in the sense of like to appoint or to establish, and of course to give. And so these are a little bit tricky because you have to pay attention to these vowels, even though the two words sound the exact same. So now let's look at one of our key verses. And this is from Genesis 6:6. And this is an interesting and important verse, partly because it has been translated and even led to some different ideas and interpretations over the years. And so let's read it together, and hopefully this will help us to understand the meaning of this sense just a little bit more. So let's read it together here first. We have Va Yi Na Chem. Va Yi Na Chem. Adonai, the Lord's name. Ki Asa. Asa. So what do we have here? We have Vayinachem Adonai ki asa. And so Nacham, that's one of our key words here for today. Nacham, and of course it begins with that va and that yod, which we've seen many times now to mean he. So, and he grieved or was consoled. And it's Adonai. So this is our subject of the verb. So, and the Lord, he grieved. He, remember that word could mean for, because, or sometimes that, as we see here, kind of giving an explanation as to what. Right? So the Lord was grieved that asa, he made. So the Lord was grieved that he made. Now, in some translations, they actually make this word to mean something like he regretted or he repented. It even says, I think, in the King James. And so sometimes this can be used in the sense that he made a mistake, that he wishes he could have done something different. He could go back, sometimes even implying that, God is not omniscient or not omnipotent. But here, I think this word, nacham, is better understood in this sense of to grieve. And I mean, this is true, that he was grieved that he had made man on the earth. Because if you remember this context, this is where he's getting ready to destroy the world with a flood, because he says the hearts of men were filled with evil thoughts nonstop. And so the Lord was grieved, right? The whole earth was just filled with evil and murder and wickedness. And so then he goes on here to finish this thought with et ha-adam, et ha-adam, ba'aretz. Et ha-adam ba'aretz. All right, so what do we have here? Well, remember that et is typically just given as, not translated, and given to let us know what's not the subject. So in other words, it's not that man, ha-adam, grieved, but it's that the Lord grieved that he had made man. Right? So it's man it's man that is sort of the object of grieving that was made, rather than doing the making or doing the grieving. Okay? And then of course we have ba'aretz. So ba meaning in, with, by, among, that preposition. And so here probably just in or on the earth. Edits. So we have again, and the Lord was grieved that he had made the man, probably also a little bit more generic since it says ha rather than just Adam. So he's grieved that he had made the man or humanity in the earth. He was sorrowful. And then he goes on to say, va yit atzev el livo. Va yit atzev el libo. And so we have here this word meaning to also be sorrowful. And so here, that word and again, and he was sorrowed. Okay. And especially with the grammar here, it's really in the sense of to be grieved in your heart or in your soul. Like you yourself are sorrowful inside of you, not at somebody else so much, but just sorrowful, feeling it. And so what is he sorrowful? He's sorrowful to or in, that's that preposition el, and then libo. Of course, lev being the word for heart, and then o, which we've seen many times now, is that pronoun for he or him or it. And so here, his heart. And so he was grieved to his heart, right? So in other words, again, it's not that God sort of made a oopsie daisy, that he made a mistake and he needs to try and go figure it out because, well, he's not really all knowing or all powerful. That's not what it's saying at all. It's really giving the context for the flood, that the Lord was grieved, that the whole earth was just filled with wickedness. And I would say he probably was even grieved about what he was about to do in terms of wiping people out, the whole earth, destroying even animals and things that were not directly evil per se, but they were affected by the evil of mankind. We know in Ezekiel 33, that the Lord does not delight in the death of even the wicked, but he wants them to turn from evil and live, as the prophet says. And so here again, this should not imply that the Lord is limited or makes mistakes, especially like the ancient gods of the other nations. This is the God who created all the world perfectly in order, but it was man who, in his own sinful desires, has chosen to destroy it over and over and over again. But that was his own free choice. But we do believe that God has a bigger and grander plan in even all of that evil and wickedness. And that would be to eventually bring about the Messiah, the one who would suffer on behalf of Ha-Adam, humanity, and ultimately lead a new people into a new heavens and new earth. So now let's talk about our next verse here, Exodus 15. So this is an interesting one because it's the Exodus story when the Lord is bringing the people out of Egypt. So let's read this here together. So we have Nachita vechasteka am zu ga'alta. So again we have na chi ta ve chas de ka am zu ga al ta. All right, so what do we have here? Well, if you notice, this is one of our key words, that word nacha. However, it looks a little different, and that's because we have a yod here instead of our he. Now, this might seem a bit strange, but it is actually very common with words that end in a he, that he letter, to either just have the he disappear or sometimes become a yod, change to a yod, whenever there's something added to the end like this. And so this ta lets us know that it's you have, right? So you have led, be, or here, ve, in, with, by, right? So in or with, chasde, which is from that word, chesed, right? Steadfast, covenant, faithful love. And then ka, you or your. So you have led with your steadfast love, right? So the whole Exodus is based on God's covenant, faithful love to the people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he goes on to say, so that's that word for people or nation, zu, which means like these or those, and then ga'al ta. So we notice here that ta again, right? Just like we had over here, ta. So that means you have done something. In this word, gala or ga'al is the word to like redeem or to set free, even in perhaps the sense of to purchase, right? So of course we have here, you have led in or with your steadfast love, your people you have redeemed. All right. Then we have nechalta ve'azeka el neve kadesheka. So again, nehalta ve'azeka el neve kadesheka. All right. And so we have here, again, that ta. So we've noticed and seen that already a few times. So that's with the verb meaning to you have done something. So you have nahal, which is a kind of another word meaning to lead. It's a little bit more in the sense of like to lead animals more so than the nacha word, which is a bit more generic. So you have led, or maybe pastured, like a shepherd, and then ve in with, right? And then az or oz is the word for strength. And then of course ka, you or your. So you have led in or with your strength. So again, this is paralleling that first line. You have led with your steadfast love. You have led with your strength. El neve, and then to the pastures, right, to the fields. And then kadesheka or kodesheka, and this is your holy place. Kadesh or kadosh. All right. And so here is like a holy place, but probably in the sense of like a sanctuary, oftentimes. So it's a little bit prophetic, to be honest, right? You have led your people with steadfast love. You have led or driven with your power to the pastures of your sanctuary. So probably in the sense of leading them to the promised land eventually. Though at this point in the story, they're not quite there yet. All right, now let's look at our verse from Isaiah 55. And so in Isaiah, this is a very interesting and popular and famous verse. So hopefully you're familiar with it. So let's read it together. We have here, ki lo machshevotai machshevotai, and then similarly here, machshevotekem, machshevotekam. All right. So what do we have here? That common word we've already seen many times, of course, ki, for, because, that. So because or for, no, right? Lo means no, for not. And this word here, machshev, is really from this root word here, chashav, meaning to think or consider. And so this is just the noun form, machshev, meaning my thoughts or just thoughts. And then, of course, we have here otai. So I on the end is my, and the ot, is plural. So my thoughts, plural. So for, not my thoughts, and then machshevotekem. So again, we have that same root word here, machshevot, machshevot, so thoughts, plural, and then kem. And so kem is that word for your, meaning you all, plural. Now, you'll notice there's no verb here. So in English, we have to supply a verb because we require a verb. But in Hebrew, they didn't have to do that. And so they could make a simple statement like this: for not my thoughts, your thoughts. In other words, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, right? Or your thoughts are not my thoughts. Okay, then we have the next part here. Ve lo velo dar kekem, de rakai, neum Adonai, velo dar kekem, de rakai, neum Adonai. So what do we have here? Of course, that very common word, the, and lo means no, right? So, and not, so you can already sense that we're paralleling that previous line. So, and not, darkekem, and that's that root word, derek, if you remember, when we learned the letter dalet. Derek means way or path or road. And so, kem, again, your, you all, so your ways, your paths are not derakai. So again, Derek, right? Derek, but this one has that I, again, paralleling that previous line. So your ways, my ways, right? So your ways are not my ways. And then we have that important word, neum Adonai. So this is a pronouncement from the Lord, him declaring through the prophet Isaiah that your ways are not my ways, right? Your thoughts, your plans are not my thoughts and my plans. Of course, implying that the ways of the Lord are far above our own. And so as his creation, as mere mortals, finite beings, we are called to trust and obey, or to follow him, because how can we know what will be the future? We don't have that knowledge, but we know that God does. And so we have to trust that his ways are the right ways, and that our ways are perhaps not, especially when they contradict and go against the very clear ways that the Lord has outlined for us. And where do we find that? We find that in his word, in God's word, in scripture, in the Bible. And so a big part of that is us seeking to better understand and interpret God's words from God's word. That way that we will have his thoughts and that we will walk in his ways, as opposed to defying him and walking in our own ways, which is the path of destruction and of death. So let's now finish up with one last go through our alphabet. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that is our Hebrew alphabet and the letter Nun. So I hope you learned something, and I do hope you will share something. And I look forward to seeing you next time with our next letter, the letter Samik. All right. See you next time.